Today we're going to talk about how to refute an argument by using counterexamples. So what's a counterexample and how does it help to refute an argument? A counterexample is an example that runs counter to some generalization and thereby shows that the generalization is false. Now, counterexamples can be used to refute an argument that contains a generalization either as one of its premises or as its conclusion. So if the argument contains a generalization as its conclusion, and the counterexample shows that the generalization is false, then in effect what the counterexample does is show that the argument reaches a false conclusion. If the argument contains a generalization as one of its premises, then the counterexample shows that that premise of the argument is false. But either way, the counterexample shows that the argument is unsuccessful, either because the argument has a false premise or because its conclusion is false. Okay, so what are some examples of counterexamples? Well, let's start by considering this argument. Premise 1. You should always treat others the same way that you would like to be treated yourself. Premise 2. I would not like anyone to change my diapers. So, conclusion, I should not change the baby's diapers. Now, this argument appears to be valid. Furthermore, I can assure you, premise 2 is true. So, if premise 1 is also true, then it looks like I have a good argument for why I shouldn't change the baby's diapers. I should get someone else to do it. But is premise 1 true? Well, premise 1 sounds familiar enough. You should always treat others the same way that you would like to be treated yourself. That's something we frequently hear people say. But that can't be precisely true. After all, I would like to be treated as an adult. But that doesn't mean that I should treat my children as adults, right? So if the generalization is that you should always treat others the same way that you would like to be treated yourself, that generalization is false. It's false because even though I would like to be treated as an adult, it doesn't mean that I should treat my children as adults. I shouldn't treat my children as adults because they're not adults, but I am. Now, that doesn't mean that I should baby my children, but I shouldn't treat them the same way that I would like to be treated myself. I shouldn't treat them as if they're adults. Okay, so that's a counterexample to premise 1. And that counterexample shows that premise 1, stated in the way that it's stated here, you should always treat others the same way that you would like to be treated yourself. Premise 1, stated in that way, is false. And so this argument does not work. This argument does not succeed in showing that I should not change the baby's diapers. The reason it doesn't succeed is because one of its premises is false. Now, premise 1 might seem to be true, but if it seems to be true, that's only because something very similar to premise 1 is true. What's similar to premise 1 that is true is the claim that you should usually, typically, often treat others the same way that you would like to be treated yourself. Now, those claims are true. You should usually treat others the same way that you'd like to be treated yourself. But that doesn't mean you should always treat others the way that you'd like to be treated yourself. That general claim about how you should always behave, that claim is false, and our counterexample shows it. So there's an example of the use of counterexample to refute an argument. Let's consider another example. So consider this argument. Premise 1. If it's wrong for all of us to perform a particular action, then it's wrong for any of us to perform that action. Premise 2. It's wrong for all of us to try to take the last piece of bread on the table. So, conclusion, it's wrong for any of us to try to take the last piece of bread on the table. You could imagine this situation. Let's say a bunch of us are sitting around the dinner table eating dinner, and there's a basket of bread in the middle of the table, and we've been, bit by bit, reaching in to take out pieces of bread and eat them. And now there's only one piece of bread left in the basket, and there are a bunch of us sitting around the table. Well, it would be wrong for all of us to jump up and grab that piece of bread and start fighting over it. That would be wrong. That would be completely unacceptable. But just because that would be unacceptable, does that mean that none of us is allowed to go and eat that last piece of bread? Well, no, that seems like a preposterous conclusion. I mean, if all of us have to sit there just staring at that last piece of bread and none of us is allowed to eat it, well, then that's wasting food. That's not an acceptable conclusion. So it's got to be okay for one of us to take that last piece of bread, even though it's not okay for all of us to try to take that last piece of bread. So here's an example where it's okay for one person to do something, even though it's not okay for everyone simultaneously to do that thing. Right? It's okay for one, it's not okay for everyone. So that's a counterexample to the generalization that occurs in premise 1 of our argument. So this argument is not a successful argument. This argument does not prove that it's wrong for any of us to try to take the last piece of bread on the table. And the reason it doesn't prove that is not because the argument is a fallacy. The reason it doesn't prove that is because premise 1 of the argument is false. Premise 1 of the argument states a general claim, and that general claim that it states is not true. While it might be true that it's usually wrong for anyone to perform an action that it's wrong for everyone to perform, it's not true that it's always wrong for anyone to perform an action that it's wrong for everyone to perform. And in fact, I just gave a counterexample to that generalization. It's not wrong for one person to take a piece of bread, the last piece of bread on the table, even though it would be wrong for everyone to try to take that piece of bread simultaneously. Okay, so there's another example of an argument that we can refute by means of counterexample. We can use a counterexample to show that premise 1 of that argument is false, and so the argument is unsuccessful. Finally, let's consider this third case. Premise 1, breaking the law is almost always wrong. Premise 2, double parking is breaking the law. So conclusion, double parking is almost always wrong. Now, can we refute this argument by means of counterexample? Well, there's no counterexample to premise 2. Premise 2 is simply true. Double parking is breaking the law. That's part of what's involved in double parking. When you double park, you are breaking the law. Well, what about premise 1? Breaking the law is almost always wrong. Is there a counterexample to that? No, there's no counterexample to premise 1 as stated. If premise 1 were to say breaking the law is always wrong, then we could produce a counterexample to premise 1. Sometimes it's an emergency, you have no choice but to double park, you have to do something very quickly. It's not wrong to double park in that situation, especially not if you're doing it for just a few seconds. It's not wrong to double park, and yet you're breaking the law because there's a law against double parking. So if premise 1 were to say breaking the law is always wrong, then there would be a counterexample to premise 1. But premise 1 doesn't say that. Premise 1 says breaking the law is almost always wrong. Now, how do you produce a counterexample to a claim of the form almost always? Well, the answer is you don't. Because even if you produce an example of a case where breaking the law is not wrong, that still doesn't show that it's false, that breaking the law is almost always wrong. Maybe breaking the law is almost always wrong, but just not in the case that you produced. So you can't produce a counterexample to a generalization of the form breaking the law is almost always wrong. That generalization might be false, but you can't show that it's false by using a counterexample. Okay, so we cannot refute this argument by means of counterexample. That's not to say that this is a good argument. In fact, this third argument is not a good argument, but we can't show that it's not a good argument by using a counterexample. So sometimes counterexample can succeed in refuting an argument, and sometimes it can't. It depends on whether the argument contains a generalization to the effect that something always happens or something is true in all cases. If the argument contains a generalization like that, an unexceptional generalization, a generalization without any room for exceptions, then a counterexample can be used to refute that generalization. But if a generalization is phrased in such a way that it admits of exceptions, like if a generalization talks about what almost always happens, or about what usually happens, about what typically happens, then we can't refute that generalization by means of counterexamples. Okay, so we can look at examples of counterexamples in the exercises that follow. See you next time.